All right, folks, this is going to be a pretty short video, so you're going to be happy that you showed up today. So trace evidence is going to be the next unit that we cover. And when you think about trace evidence, the main thing that I want you to think about is if you talk about having a trace of something, that idea is simply that you have a very small piece of material that's associated with a crime scene. So trace evidence does not mean necessarily the type of evidence, it means the amount of evidence. So it could be any type of evidence. It could be blood, it could be dirt, it could be fuzz from a piece of carpet, it could be some pollen. It's just a very small piece of evidence. Regardless of what the evidence is, it's going to be evidence that's been transferred from person to person or between the person and the crime scene. So it could be even something like a partial fingerprint that was left behind at the crime scene. It could be something where the perpetrator is scratched by the person they attack, and some of the perpetrator's skin cells end up under the victim's fingernails. That would be trace evidence. This is what is called Locard's exchange principle. Remember, from the beginning of the semester, we talked about this. Edmund Locard said, and I'm summarizing, paraphrasing, no matter where you go, no matter how careful you are, you leave small, even microscopic bits of yourself behind. And bits of yourself doesn't necessarily mean like body parts. It could be, like I said, the dirt from the bottom of your shoe, or it could be a fiber from the clothing that you're wearing. And Locard also said that any time that you are any place, you pick up small or even microscopic pieces of your environment. So maybe you touch the faucet in a public restroom and you get some of somebody else's oil from their hands or from their body that was on the faucet, that gets transferred to you. I know it's kind of a gross thought. So Locard's exchange principle is definitely in play here. So some examples of trace evidence. Hair and fibers, which is what we're going to focus on. It's the easiest thing for us to do, whether we're in class or not. Small pieces of glass. You wouldn't think that glass could be that helpful to a crime scene, and you're not going to convict someone of a crime based only on glass. Well, I suppose you could if it was a really rare type of glass. But in general, you're not going to convict someone, but it's like we've talked about all semester. If you have many of these small pieces, you can put it together to paint a picture of who was at the crime scene and who may have committed the crime. Paint chips, maybe somebody swipes your car, you parked your car out on the curb at night and hit and run. They smash the back tail light, so you've got some pieces of plastic, and some of their paint scrapes off onto the side of your car. And that paint, I can tell you, my husband works at an auto parts store, and the paint for every different make and model of car is just a little bit different. So they really can narrow down the paint that's left behind at a hit and run like this to, a silver Toyota Corolla that was manufactured in the early 2000s. That really is a thing. Dirt could be a type of trace evidence, and so could any plant material. So could a drop of blood. So could an eyelash. Any of those things, because remember, it's the size of the evidence, not the type of evidence, that qualifies it as trace evidence. Because it has to do with size and not the amount or the kind of evidence, trace evidence could be either biological or physical. We talked about this. Biological evidence is evidence that came from something that was at one point in time, recently, alive. And that's where, plant particles, whether it's a twig or a leaf or pollen or a seed, it could be insects, it could be mushroom spores, it could be moth cocoons, it could be anything, and I'm using specifically non-human examples because it could be skin cells, it could be blood, it could be semen, it could be urine, it could be toenail clippings. Those all would be considered biological trace evidence. Physical evidence could be a scrap of paper. It could be, remember, fingerprints are considered physical evidence because even though they're left behind by a person, the fingerprint itself is not made of living substances. It's made of oils and fluids and colored substances like ink or paint or blood. Other physical evidence might be, like we talked about, the dirt. It could be the piece of plastic or the piece of glass. So trace evidence could be from either of those categories. And the thing is, depending on what type of crime you're investigating, that might be the only evidence that there is linking the suspect to the crime scene. So trace evidence has to be handled very carefully so that it's not damaged or destroyed or lost in transfer from the crime scene to the lab. Most of the time, trace evidence is going to be considered class evidence. Again, as a reminder, class evidence is evidence that puts whatever you have into a group. So we talked about blood types being class evidence. Type A blood. Lots of people have type A blood, but if you find type A blood at the scene of the crime, that the perpetrator may have cut themselves and left their blood behind, and it's type A, if you have a suspect who is type O blood, you can exclude them as a suspect because they're not the ones that left the blood behind at the scene of the crime. And if you have someone who is type A blood as a suspect, that doesn't mean that they committed the crime because there are lots of people that have type A blood, but it does mean that they're still in the running for the person that you are looking at as having committed the crime. So you can exclude suspects, but you can't probably pinpoint one person. And that's as far as we're going today. So hang tight because next time we're here on video, we'll be talking about hair, and that will be exciting. So until then, I will see you in the funny papers.